Good morning, everybody. So, as you can see, my name's Claire Kendall, and this is my job, UK Affairs Producer with BBC News. So I will tell you over the next half hour or so a little bit about what that means. I'm part of the North of England team with the BBC. So I'm based in Salford, and we basically are the network team that supply news to the BBC in London. So I don't do anything for Look North or any of the local programmes particularly. I'm the network team based in the North. And the North of England team has a series of correspondents, a series of producers and a series of shoot edits. And we supply news to 5 Live and BBC Breakfast in Salford and to all of the people down in London, whether that's anything from the news channel to online, the PM programme, Radio 4, you name it, we supply stuff to them. So in Salford, there are 2 types of correspondents. There are general correspondents that do general news, and then there are specialist correspondents and the producers that go with them, and that's what I do, and there are more of them in London as well. So that's a little bit about me, but there'll be lots more to come. Let me just start by showing you a few pictures of my day, the sorts of things that I've often been involved in. So I'm sitting in the back of a police car there with a police officer and a mental health nurse, and we spent 3 days and nights with them filming as they went out to 999 calls for people that were in mental health crisis. There's a picture there of Sophie Rayworth presenting. Often we'll be having to support the presenters. I worked with her on the general election as well. We have to get involved in various public order stories. That's in Belfast, where police are obviously getting ready for potentially a public order incident. There's a protest there, and also they're in the back streets waiting to come if needs be. So I've been on a riot training course to make sure that if I was involved in an incident like that, I'd have some idea of what to do and how to get out of there. So, you're a producer, what exactly do you do? So, has anybody any idea what being a producer means? Could anybody tell me what they think of being a producer is?
You produce the show, so like you do the running order, and you like assign who's doing what, and just tell them what to like do when they're shooting.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, that's one role as a producer. Anybody got any other ideas of what a producer does?
Just all the organisational aspects of the production you're working on.
Yeah, that's right. Excellent. Yeah. Any other thoughts on what other producers might do? Well, if not, hopefully you might learn a little bit about it this morning. So I will show you a picture now of our newsroom in London there. This is at New Broadcasting House in London. This is the newsroom that I work towards. And what you've got is the news desk in the middle here. And all around the outside are lots of different desks doing lots of different jobs. So over here you've got the radio bulletins desk. They're writing all of the bulletins for radios 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You've got the desks here where the people for the 1, 6 and 10 o'clock news sit. You've got the UK online desk, you've got News Channel and BBC World, and so what's happened is this half round here is foreign, that half is home. Generally, that's how it works. But if you went and spoke to the majority of these people here and asked them what they did, they would be a producer. And they would be doing very different jobs, but they would all be producers. And if you don't think you've seen enough producers there, well, if you look above the newsroom, you will see banks of offices either side because it's set right, the newsroom's set right down in the middle. And here you can just see the word business. So this is the business unit, full of more producers and correspondents. You'll have the Radio 4 programmes up here, the PM programme, the Today programme, and all the other sort of specialist teams, health, home affairs, education, and they're all, in effect, producers. So, production or news in the BBC is split into two halves, in effect, input and output. We call input news gathering because we gather news together. That's who I work for. We supply the news to the programmes. And output are the people that put out the programmes, whether that's radio, TV, online, whatever. So I have got a colleague of mine called Caroline Alton. She is a producer on the 6 and 10 o'clock news. So she works with the programme, she's assigned stories, and she makes sure those stories get to air. So she works for output. And you'll have to excuse me because I only filmed this on my phone, but there's Caroline. I don't know what the sound quality will be like, but I've got her to explain a little bit about what her job is.
As a producer on the 6 and 10 o'clock news, I'm assigned a story on a daily basis, and I see that through the entire day, from the moment it's assigned to the finished product that goes out on air, and I'm responsible for that editorially, legally and visually. And what that means is I'm, as soon as I get that story, looking at what pictures we need, what interviews we need, if we need to set up interviews with people to make that story work, to get the reporter and camera crews in the right place, and what the look of any graphics will be, what they look like pictorially, what their backing is, and also the text and the content of them, working with the graphic designer to make that happen. And we do that in an incredibly short period of time. Sometimes it's the length of a shift, 10 hours is what it takes to get that film and report together. But news just doesn't happen at the start of the day and isn't pre-planned. So sometimes we will work on something throughout the day and then just have to junk it and start on something completely new if there's a big breaking story. So you might not have the luxury of 10 hours to do that. Sometimes we might have only an hour or two to get that whole process together and go into an edit suite with a picture editor and edit that film. So it's quite a time-pressured environment, and you have to juggle lots of balls at the same time.
She does, she basically gets given a story and she has to make sure that that story gets on air, right through to the point where you'll probably saw at the very beginning where I had the gallery up, that's the 6 o'clock news gallery. She has to be in there making sure that story gets on air. I've also spoken to another of my colleagues called Judy, and she works for the same department as me, but she works for planning, and she can explain a little bit about the process, because obviously it's a long process from getting a story and filming it through to making sure everybody knows about that story, through to getting it out on things like the 6 and 10 o'clock news.
My job as a senior broadcast journalist on the planning desk is mostly for network news. We work with the BBC News channel and the bulletins, 1, 6, 10 o'clock news, 5 Live, Radio 2, summaries, Radio 4, you name it, part of the BBC News, we work with them. And what we do is we work with our specialists and our teams around the country, people like education and arts, people in Leeds and Manchester, sport, science, business. They come to us with story ideas that they want to get on air, and my team, a team of B broadcast journalists and senior broadcast journalists, help them get those stories out to the programmes. We provide them with camera crews and production effort. We go to planning meetings with diaries with all their story ideas and offers on them, and then we sell them to the programmes, and hopefully the right story finds the right place on the right news output.
So that's Judy. So I'm the UK Affairs producer. What exactly do I do? Well, I basically have to find stories, and I have to sell those stories to the 6 o'clock news. And My aim is not to be an on-the-day news reporter or producer. I have to actually come up with ideas. My brief is to find stories that are not being covered enough, issues within the UK, and also to find people that you would not expect to usually see on the 6 o'clock news. So in my reports, it's very rare that you will find politicians, spokespeople for companies, this sort of thing. I'm looking for real people that are going through real situations to explain what news stories are. So, for example, I will have a look and see what an issue is that hasn't been covered as much as we would like it to have been. I have to think of that story, I have to contact people, I have to find access. That's the key to what we do, access, being able to follow people's lives and being able to see the story in action. And then usually that story, I speak to the 6 o'clock news and we will arrange a date where it'll go out on the 6 o'clock news, and usually we'll do something for online as well, and we'll usually do something for the PM programme, because usually all of our stuff is weighted towards the end of the day. So that's sort of how what I do works. Now, how I got there. Before I got there, it was a long route. I think 21 years I've been in the BBC now. So I started off doing an English literature degree and a postgraduate journalism diploma. I then worked in BBC Local Radio for 3 years, and it was really at that point that I started to get a feel for the difference between producers and reporters. And at that point, although I did some reporting, I realised that the sort of presentation side was less of interest to me, but the production side, the organising, the setting up, the thinking of the stories was where I wanted to be. So after 3 years in local radio, I moved to London and I worked down in Television Centre doing a range of different jobs. As you'll see, the word producer comes up with pretty much all of them. And some of it was with the news gathering side, gathering the news together and offering it to programmes, but it's also really important to make sure that in the organisation that I work in, that you understand about how the programme works as well as supplying to the programme. So I also did some time with the Today programme as one, and I also spent some time with the 10 o'clock news. And then about 10 years ago, I decided to move north and join the network team up here, did a range of roles with that, and that's where I still am today. Spent a bit of time actually as the editor of the team as well. So that's the sort of route I took to get to where I am today. So going back to a bit of the stories I do and explaining a little bit further. So I work with a correspondent. The correspondent I work particularly with at the moment is this man here, Jeremy Cook. And I usually work with one of two shoot edits who are both absolutely fantastic at what they do. They film everything, they edit everything with us, TV and radio. We'll put graphics together. We will put pieces together for the website, headlines, pretty much everything. So here we have a lady called Natasha and her son Henry, and we've been following them for some time, and sadly they are due to be evicted from their flat on the 7th of December. So that's one of the stories I'm working on at the moment. The rise in the number of evictions across the UK and how that affects people, particularly families. So we're doing some work with them at the moment. Here's Jeremy with a man called Joe, who we were working with earlier this year. Joe is a long-time drug addict. He was homeless when we first met him, and he was very lucky to be part of a project which meant that houses were given to people who were still misusing drugs or alcohol. And he's very happy there because that is the day that he got the keys for his flat. So we followed him through from when he was homeless, where he showed us where he'd been sleeping on the streets, where he'd been using, right through to the day that he was given a flat by a housing association with the help of a charity. I'm not sure he chose the wallpaper, but he was very happy to be in the flat anyway. So as you can see now, it's quite specialist, the area I work in. In the past, I have done lots of general news. You'll see from the list there, I've covered lots of news stories, either in the production role or in the role that they would often call IC, in charge, where you're overseeing where everybody's going, what they're doing, either on the ground. So on the day that Raoul Moat was found up in Northumberland, I don't know whether you remember him, he was on the run after shooting a police officer. So I was in charge of the team in Rothbury on the day that Raoul Moat was captured. And so I've done stories like that, Raoul Moat, Dale Cregan, the man who killed 2 police officers over in Manchester, Derek Bird, who shot 12 people in Cumbria, right through to sort of general election and the Scottish devolution. So I would be involved in that. And then also sort of lighter stuff, so I covered stuff for the royal wedding of William and Kate, the Diamond Jubilee, where we were down in London covering bits and pieces like that. So a whole range, but where I specialise now, as you know, is UK affairs, and this is one of the pieces that I worked on, and it gives you a bit of an idea of the style that I now try and work on. We almost call ourselves like a little documentary unit, where we try and get the access, get the story, and also film it in a way that is completely different to other pieces you see on the news. So we try and have a certain style to the way we film things, and we try and present it in a way that is much more organic, really. So we'd been keeping an eye on a few bits and pieces. We were looking for another story to do, and we kept noticing that police forces from around the north were permanently churning out press releases about people going missing. So we went and had a meeting with Greater Manchester Police, and they said, this is a huge issue for us. We are spending huge amounts of money on people who go missing repeatedly. And as a result of that, we've set up our own special unit to focus on repeat missings, because it is absolutely draining us to try and sort this out. So they gave us access for 3 days and 3 nights to film with this team. And we did a little report, which this is the report that went on the 6 and 10 o'clock news, but we did one for radio as well. And we also did some stuff for the website. So I'll play this piece for you.
Plainclothes police, a special unit, on the road and on the hunt for a teenager missing from a care home. The 15-year-old girl is vulnerable, in danger. It's urgent but frustrating. Her friends insist they haven't seen her. This Manchester team's only job is to track down vulnerable missing people, and they're flat out. Some teenagers have run away and been returned hundreds of times.
This female's 15, she's got a history, she's been missing 54 times in total, but within the last 7 months she's been missing 48 times.
It's an expensive business. Our girl has cost the police £70,000 this year alone. Like many others, she often sneaks into city centre hotels to use empty rooms. The detectives have brought us along while they search the guest floors, but if she is here, they can't find her. So the search goes on. Maybe she's gone to her mum's place, but no luck here either. Just mounting frustration and tears.
I care deeply. People don't understand. She doesn't understand how much dearly I love my kids. And it's disgusting what we've been through. Disgusting. You know how many times I've sat here and said to my daughter, do you want to go out? And end up getting gripped by the next wrong un and then wake up knocked out. Don't know what's happened to you with your knickers around your ankles.
Out in the city, her girl is still missing as darkness falls. In Manchester alone, tracking down missing people costs nearly £30 million a year. The Chief Constable here is calling for new, innovative ways to protect vulnerable people.
It's not sustainable not only in terms of money terms, but I don't think it's acceptable in terms of the risk. And if you've got police officers ultimately spending a lot of their time doing social work, you get to the point of actually saying, well, perhaps we ought to employ more social workers, if indeed that means fewer police officers, because ultimately we are using the wrong professional to deal with this issue.
It's the next morning, and we're back on the road with the early shift. At last, some good news. The girl's back at the care home where she lives. But why does she go missing? And what does she want?
Just to be home with my mum. I want us to be happy without me being in care. I can't even sleep at my mate's house without them all knowing.
When you go missing, what is it that you do?
Well, there's a lot of things, we'll either be in hotels or we'll be drinking, or I've been caught in stolen cars before.
Has anything bad happened to you out there?
No.
You've managed to stay safe?
Yeah.
Safe? Well, that's what she says. But hard experience tells these cops she fits the profile of youngsters who fall victim to sexual exploitation, or worse.
If we take our eye off the ball, the bottom line is these children could be killed. And it's as simple as that. These children could die because they put in themselves, or they end up in situations that they can't get out of.
The police will always have a frontline role in keeping young people safe. But should they routinely have to track down vulnerable teenagers who repeatedly go missing? The girl we filmed today ran away again just hours after we met her. Jeremy Cook, BBC News, Manchester.
Greater Manchester Police. Everything else is what we would call upsound. So you've got little nuggets of people. You don't introduce the CCTV by saying, here's some CCTV. You've got one of the police officers saying, have we checked the CCTV? So it's ways of being able to introduce pictures, write to pictures, build up a picture of a scene without actually spelling it out completely. So that was the style of the piece. Now, there are 101 other things we've got to think of to be able to put that piece out. Mainly, we're dealing with people who are very vulnerable. Obviously, mum was vulnerable, daughter was vulnerable. And so you're in a position where you have some quite strict guidelines to be able to put that stuff on air. So both of them were voiced up by actors. We've got some quite good actors over in Salford that we get in to be able to do that so that it doesn't feel like it's just been voiced up by another producer, to give it a bit more of a realistic feel. But we have a duty of care to those people. We have to think very carefully about when we put them on air. Are they happy to go on air? They might be happy at the time. Mum was very angry because daughter was missing. But beyond that, if she tells us that information, is it safe to tell us? Obviously, we didn't show where she lived. We were very careful about hiding that. And we have a duty of care both to her and also to the daughter. And then going back to Joe, who's in the, who's got his flat, the drug user who's got his flat. Because after that report has been put on air, what we don't want is them to be put at more risk as a result of the fact of the interviews they've done and what they've said to us. So we need to consider that. We need to consider tone. We need to consider balance. We need to look and make sure we're legally okay to be able to do that. We obviously had access to the care home there. There was quite a lot of calls with Manchester Social Services to sort all of that side out. So by the time you get the finished product, there are hours and hours of work behind that have gone into that sort of piece. Most of it is done by the producer. So they're in charge of making sure that, you know, by the time that piece is handed down to London, you know, there aren't any legal errors in there, that there isn't anybody going to be coming to complain afterwards that that's not what they really said, or you they didn't realise they weren't being filmed. You have to be quite clear with everybody in that piece how they're going to be presented. And so that's some of the work that, I spend quite a lot of time looking at that sort of thing as well. So the correspondent I'm working with at the moment mainly is Jeremy Cook. I've been working with him for the last couple of years. He's worked in the BBC even longer than me, and he spent a lot of time as a foreign correspondent. And so I got him to talk a little bit about what he thinks a good producer is. So I will let you have a listen to what he's got to say.
Hi guys, I'm Jeremy Cook, the BBC's UK affairs correspondent. I think I've got that right. I've been in the BBC for about 27 years, mainly worked overseas until the last 10 years or so, and I've worked with many different kinds of producers around the world and around the UK, and I think the one thing that the good ones all have in common is that they are team builders. They are the people who bring a team together to start off with, and then they become the cement that holds the team together. Now, they may not always be the most senior person, so they're not always the team leader, although they often are, but they are people who see the big picture, who understand what the overall mission statement is. So if I, as a correspondent, are worried about what questions I'm going to be asking in an interview that's coming up, or exactly what we're going to say in a piece to camera, the producer will be thinking, where does this fit into the piece, and where does the piece actually fit into the program that we're preparing it for? I do think that producers need to be pretty much masters of everything these days, including the technical side of things, increasingly, which people of your generation, I'm sure, will be thinking and talking about. But more traditionally, producers needed to be the bridge between the team and the program, the output editors, and to make sure they're getting what they want. Also, they're quite often the people who make first contact with the public, with the people we're trying to persuade to go on the television, and consequently they have to be really quite persuasive and have really good people skills. They also need to be creative. Increasingly, to make good television news is not just a question of reporting the news, but thinking of new, innovative, creative ways to do that. I think the other point I would make is that many producers that I've met basically come in two kinds. The people who are really good at logistics, who will get you into Afghanistan, into the far-flung corners of the world, or the people who are more creative, who will sit in to a television edit, a radio edit, and really bring some creativity to that. The really, really good ones that are pretty rare to find are those who tick all of those boxes. And if you can do that, you will really be getting somewhere. The final point I would make, and perhaps the most important one, is the best producers are the most tenacious people you will ever meet. They are the people who drive the team forward. When everybody's tired and just wants to stop, they know what is missing from the piece that we're producing, and they will go that extra mile. And on that tone, I would say that perhaps the most important thing to understand is that for a television news team, a radio team out in the field, no is never an option, and the best producers really get that.
So Jeremy sums up quite well what we have to do. No isn't an option. We have to find some way round being able to do, if they want us to do a piece, we have to find a way to be able to do that piece. And if some people won't speak to us, there'll be other ways around doing it, so you've got to be a little bit creative with it. So you might decide you want to be a producer of the future, so what exactly do you have to do? Well, I think that the kind of producers that you'll all be will be very, very different to the sort of producer that I am now, because you're starting in a very different environment. So you might have to do a little bit of this. Operate a drone. That's us having had a drone up in Gateshead. You'll probably have to pick up the camera. This here is Peter Cooper, who has just retired but is one of the best cameramen the BBC had, and he was based in Northern Ireland and filmed throughout all of the Troubles. You might even have to do a little bit of this. As the light was fading, that is the producer based in the southwest of England who also operates the satellite truck and made sure that the live we did that night got onto the 6 o'clock news. But even more so, and I'm sure you're all very aware of all this sort of thing, but the BBC is trying to find ways of accessing new audiences and new ways of doing it. So quite often now we will put a picture on Instagram before our piece goes on air, just to highlight it. We might tweet something, pop it on Facebook, and more recently we've been starting to use Periscope and Vine a little bit, and these things are changing all the time. But this is going to really be the future of how we put our news out. And to be able to do that, the BBC is providing us with lots of different apps to do that. So Lucy Live is a way that a lot of people now report live radio or file reports into London. We've got PNG, which is the way of filing video and pictures. And we also have access to the internal BBC systems from our iPhones and our laptops. And also Davina here is our archive. If we need to get hold of any other pieces that have run before, then we can download those while we're out on the road. So this is changing all the time. Some of these apps weren't even there 2 years ago. So things are changing and will continue to change. And I spoke to my boss just before I came to see you today, and he'd been down in London yesterday, and he had some sort of pretty interesting statistics for us that show us the way things are going in the future. So over the Paris terror attacks, which we've obviously seen since last Friday, BBC Online and Language Services have had 47 million unique users. And of those 47 million, 80% accessed them on the mobile. So this is really where things are going. How can we turn the sort of journalism I did there with the missing piece into things that people can access on their mobile phones? And it's not necessarily going to be in the form of a report like that, although it could be that, but it could be chunks of people talking, facts, and that's what we need to, as the BBC, that's our challenge for the future, really. That's where we need to see where we're going. But what we mustn't forget, beyond all of that, is not that we need to fall asleep at night, but that the producer needs to remember, as Jeremy was saying, that being part of the team, as well as filing from one of your new apps and making sure that you haven't dropped a legal clanger, you need to make sure you know where your team are sleeping that night. You need to make sure that you're getting the logistics sorted out of where you're going to stay, finding hotel rooms, how are you going to get there, how long is it going to take before you need to be up and off the next day, where are you filming the next day, and all of those logistics. And finally, making sure that the team are fed and watered. Always make sure you can get them a cup of tea. So that's really the end of the role. Now, what I've done here is I've just popped a couple more pictures of things I just happened to have taken on my iPhone when I've been out and about at various stories recently, just to show you where we can be from one day to the next. This is Peter here using some tracks in a boat, and Jeremy filming in Scunthorpe, which is a piece we put out I think last week or week before. So, what exactly do you want to know? And I will try and answer it. Is there anything that's come up there that I haven't really explained clearly enough, or anything you want to know anything more about? Please feel free to ask me. I'll start with you.
I noticed that the other producer you spoke about was a woman and the planner was a woman,
Yeah.
you're a woman. Is there a lot of women who are producers, and if so, why do you think it's normally women?
Yeah, I think that mainly it is women who are producers, and historically there's been far too many men who've been correspondents, and the BBC are trying very hard to address that now. So as you know, Katya Adler is now our Europe editor. Laura Kunsberg is now our political editor. So there has been a move on that front. But I think that in terms of the reason why more women are producers is that a lot of women naturally find organising pretty easy, or it's something that they have some skills in. And so you will, in the North of England team, there aren't any male producers at all. We're all women. Yes, you were going to ask me something.
How bureaucratic is your job, and like, do you get hands-on that often, or is it mainly sort of like work?
No, I do all the filming on the road. I'll set everything up. So I'm based in Salford. I live in Leeds, and my correspondent lives in South Wales, and my main cameraman lives in Liverpool. So we spend most of our time either on the road or sitting in a car park in a van, usually a supermarket car park so we can get a cup of tea, and then we go from location to location. In terms of the bureaucracy of the BBC, then for us the best thing is we deal directly with the programmes, and that can have its ups and downs because they have a news agenda. If you've worked on a feature, most of the pieces we work on can take somewhere between 12 and 16 weeks to come to air. And so actually hitting a day when you can get that piece out, when the 6 o'clock news can run it, when the PM programme can run it, can take some jiggling. And, you know, in fact, I think one piece we did earlier this year got pulled at 5 o'clock. And that's difficult because by that stage, everybody's picked up on it, not just within national news, but then local programmes, radio programmes are trying to run with it as well. So if we then pull it, it can affect them. So you are part of a very big machine when you're trying to put some journalism like that out to air, and it can be difficult. Anybody got any other questions? Yes?
In your time as being a producer, do you have a personal favourite story that you've produced, like, overall?
Yes, probably. So back in 2002, a team of us went to Everest Base Camp for 5 weeks to do a half-hour live programme on BBC One to mark the 50th anniversary of the first ascent of Everest. So we did some pieces that went out on the 6 o'clock news and radio, and then we also did this half-hour programme on BBC One. So it's probably that one, yeah. Sorry, yes, go on.
The way the industry's moving seems to be more towards freelancers than permanent staff. Do you think this is the kind of work that can be done on a freelance basis?
I think this sort of work can be done on a freelance basis, the sort of thing I do, because lots of documentary teams already do that. So if you look at documentaries, I think within Panorama, half come from within the BBC and half are commissioned outside the BBC by independent production companies. But actually within BBC News at the moment, everybody is a member of staff who works on that sort of thing or on a contract. So I could see that it might go that way, but not at the moment.
So what about like most difficult, dangerous, sensitive story which you were produced a program about?
Let's have a think. So in terms of the most dangerous, it's probably some of the, I mean, things have calmed down a lot in Northern Ireland recently, but I was going over there quite a lot sort of 10, 15 years ago, and neither side were very keen on the BBC. And during the marching season, there was a time when there was a march over in Derry or Londonderry, and I got caught between the marchers going down, and then there was some railings, and then there was everybody else on the other side of it, and I was trying to keep out of the shot of our cameraman and ended up wedged between the railings and a group of people who were there to see the Orange Parade, and they're not very keen on the BBC. So I had to get out of that situation pretty quickly. In terms of sensitivity, I worked with Michael Buchanan earlier this year on a story based in Sheffield about South Yorkshire Police, where Michael was basically passed a document that showed that there were over 200 girls, now women, who had suffered child sex exploitation and had never been given the help they needed and had basically been pushed to one side, and the work that South Yorkshire Police had done hadn't been followed through. And so we had to go and find some of these women who 10 years down the line had not had any help, and we had to go and knock on doors, find ways of getting them and contacting some of them. And sadly, most of them were in positions where their lives were very chaotic. They had mental health problems, they were in abusive relationships, and you have to get quite close to these people to be able for them to trust you so that they will talk to you. And with that comes a certain level of support and counselling that's needed to be able to do that. Any other questions from anybody?
Is there like a piece of advice that you would give, and do you think it's possible for like a recent graduate to go straight to like television, or would you recommend like starting in radio first?
Well, I started in radio first, and I found that much easier. I think television's quite hard and quite complicated, and I think it is an easier way of doing it, but lots of people do start in television. I think the best piece of advice I would give is in my job now, I will often come across people who have managed to get themselves a day or a week's work experience, and occasionally I will go and sit myself in BBC Yorkshire, and there was one particular young person who happened to be sitting at the desk next to me when I plonked myself down, and I asked them a bit about them and what they were doing and all the rest of it, and then that's where the conversation ended. She didn't know what I did. She didn't know the kind of work that I was involved in. And so what I would say to you is that any opportunity when you walk through the door of anywhere is to actually use your people skills. Get in there and chat to people. You know, if people are busy, you can understand that. But if people have got 5 minutes for you, find out as much as you can. Because what could have happened on that day is if I'd got talking to her and she'd expressed an interest, I could potentially have asked her to come and spend a day with me in the coming weeks, and she lost that opportunity. And so if you do meet people and you do have the chance to do that, don't feel shy or afraid. Go in there and ask. You know, I'm not saying be over pushy, but you know, go in there and try and learn as much as you can and make as many contacts as you can and find out as much as you can, really. Are we out of time or? Oh, okay. Any more questions?
On the national news, do you
Yeah.
think there's a good enough balance between coverage of the north and the south?
No. And that's one of the reasons why I do this job I do, because I first started this job with Richard Bilton. He was the correspondent that was brought up from London, and I worked with him for a number of years, and the whole reason is because the balance between the two was not there. I think it's better than it was, better than 10, 15 years ago, but and I think that there is an awareness. So, for example, I was down in London about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and the editor of the 6 and 10 o'clock news came up to me and my correspondent and said, right, Scunthorpe. We've heard from everybody in London, we've heard all the politicians talking about what's happening with the steel industry, we've had all of these, you know, pundits on. I want you to go and get under the skin of Scunthorpe. And that is our job, to get under the skin of the job, to hear from the people we haven't heard from, which was one of the photos there was Jeremy sitting round a table. That was 3 generations of steel worker there, which actually within the family have had 5 generations, and that's what they want, but we need to still do more of.
From like my own experience, it can be quite hard trying to get placements or work experience in the BBC, and as an organisation that's kind of owned by the public,
Yeah, I think it's difficult because when I first started off, I did some independent and some BBC work experience. I think that the problem they've had more recently is that they've decided to try and make work experience available by having to apply through the website, which is really frustrating. But what was happening was that because they are a publicly funded company, they need to be seen to be fair to everybody. And what was happening was, you know, so-and-so's mate of a mate's son was ending up doing a week. And, you know, just because they know somebody, is that fair that they end up in that position when somebody else doesn't? But I know that we arranged for somebody from Northumbria University to get some work experience, which I agreed with my line manager. So this kind of comes back to the point I was making earlier about the girl that I was sitting next to. You know, if you know of somebody in that position, or you ever find yourself in that position, just use that to the best of your ability. You know, if I was in your position and I'd filled something in on the website and I'd still not heard it, I'd be like, right, okay, what options have I got now? Go back to what Jeremy says. You don't take no for an answer. So, you know, you look at the news and you see, for example, Danny Savage or Judith Moritz are the correspondents that do general news in the north of England. You know, to start with, join them on Facebook or tweet them something, tell them who you are, send them an email, find other ways to be able to try and get that experience, because the BBC becomes absolutely inundated, and they've all, at one point they used to let people from 16 come in, now they've raised the level because what they found was it's just, otherwise they would end up with problems of the numbers of people that they had to deal with. So yeah, try and find another way if you can. Anybody else? Yes, he did, yeah. Yeah.
I'll go on.
Yeah.
Okay, what do you think about the loophole that allows people to watch catch-up TV on the iPlayer without a TV license? It's one of the reasons why the BBC is cutting £35 million from its...
Well, it's not really a loophole, it's actually just somebody, because if it puts up saying, do you have a license? And so if you don't have a license, then obviously you're doing it illegally, aren't you?
So do you think that's okay then? Because I mean, they just...
What, do I think it's okay to ignore the fact that, well, no, because that's my salary. So obviously I want everybody to have a license.
Right, okay. Because they just announced this morning that they're killing off the red button as well now, so that's...
Basically, the situation is in the BBC is that they're having to make huge cuts at the moment, and they're having to look, obviously charter renewal is coming up, and they are having to look at how the BBC is funded, and we now have to pay for everybody over 75 to have a license. And so there's a working group in the BBC at the moment that are looking about how to make those changes, and I think that how things are now will not be the same as how they are in the next year. I think there'll be some big changes. Anybody else got any questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for listening. Okay, thank you.